Alright, so today we're diving into the top 3 toughest psychology concepts you'll encounter on the MCAT. Psychology may seem more straightforward than some other subjects, but certain concepts can be surprisingly tricky, especially when applied in the context of MCAT questions. By the end of this video, you'll have a solid understanding of these challenging topics and tips on how to approach them. Let's get started. Concept 1. Classical and operant conditioning. Behavioral learning. First up is behavioral learning, specifically classical and operant conditioning. These are foundational psychology concepts, but they often show up in ways that require deep understanding of the differences and applications. Here's why it's tough. You need to distinguish between classical conditioning, where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a reflexive response, and operant conditioning, where behavior is modified by reinforcement or punishment. Understanding the nuances of reinforcement schedules, e.g., fixed versus variable ratio and interval schedules, can be tricky, especially when applied in real-life scenarios. The MCAT often tests your ability to identify these types of conditioning in complex passages or experimental setups, which requires a firm grasp on how each method works. To master this, focus on practicing questions that test conditioning in applied scenarios. Break down each experiment and identify the stimulus, response, and types of reinforcement or punishment being used. Concept 2. Memory systems, encoding, storage, and retrieval. Next up is memory, specifically how we encode, store, and retrieve information. This is another concept that seems simple on the surface, but can get complicated quickly. Here's why it's tough. You'll need to differentiate between different types of memory, like sensory memory, short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Understanding how different types of memory work in terms of encoding, how information is processed, storage, how it's maintained over time, and retrieval, how it's accessed, is essential. Concepts like implicit versus explicit memory, episodic versus semantic memory, and retrieval cues add layers of complexity to the way memory functions on the MCAT. To succeed with memory questions, make sure you understand the distinctions between each memory type and process. Practice applying these concepts to experimental data, as the MCAT often presents memory in the context of research or case studies. Concept 3. Social influence, conformity, obedience, and group dynamics. Finally, we have social influence, specifically how people are affected by conformity, obedience, and group dynamics. This area of psychology can be conceptually challenging because it involves understanding how individuals behave in the context of society. Here's why it's tough. You'll need to understand theories of conformity, like Ash's conformity experiments, and obedience, like Milgram's shock experiments, and how these phenomena influence behavior. Group dynamics, such as groupthink, social loafing, and de-individuation, add complexity as you must understand how individuals behave differently in group settings. The MCAT loves to test these concepts by presenting scenarios where multiple forms of social influence are at play, requiring you to analyze the situation from multiple angles. To master this, focus on case studies and classic experiments in social psychology and practice analyzing group behavior in the context of real-world examples. Wrapping it up, let's recap the top 3 toughest psychology concepts on the MCAT. Classical and operant conditioning challenge your ability to differentiate between learning methods and reinforcement schedules. Memory systems test your understanding of how we encode, store, and retrieve information, requiring familiarity with multiple types of memory. Social influence involves understanding how conformity, obedience, and group dynamics shape individual behavior, often tested through case studies and experiments. These topics can be difficult, but with practice, you can definitely master them. If you need more help with MCAT prep, check out the King of the Curve app or visit kingofthecurve.org for hundreds of practice questions and strategies to help you succeed. Keep pushing forward, and let's get closer to that top score together.